The docking of the Odyssey was an exercise in silence. On the observation deck of the Galactic Council Citadel, delegates from a dozen star systems watched the human vessel align with its assigned port. The ship was a brute, a thick-bodied wedge of scarred dark metal that seemed to absorb the station's pristine light. It bore no elegant nacelles, no shimmering energy fields. It was a functional, ugly thing, and its presence felt less like an arrival and more like an intrusion. Ambassador David stood at the fore of the small human contingent, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. He watched the Citadel's docking arms extend, their movements fluid and noiseless, a stark contrast to the shuddering mechanics of his own ship. Beside him, Dr. Aris Thorne tracked the process on a handheld datapad, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Pressure is nominal. Umbilical lock is green," she murmured, her voice a low counterpoint to the hum of the observation deck's life support. David gave a slight nod, his gaze fixed on the alien figures watching them through the thick, transparent wall. He was a man built for endurance, lean and wired with a stillness that felt unnatural in a place of such gentle, constant motion. He had learned that stillness in the turbulent drop zones of orbital stations and the chaotic, shifting landscapes of deep space test flights, where a wasted movement could mean a fatal miscalculation. On the other side of the viewport, High Counselor Vorlog of the Xylan delegation stood rigid. His obsidian-like head, smooth and ovoid, was angled slightly, processing the visual data of the human ship with dispassionate curiosity. He was the epitome of his species, logical, precise, and utterly devoted to the universal constants that governed all civilized existence. A junior technician, a small, multi-limbed being named Plea, chirped a soft report from a nearby console. "High Counselor, the preliminary ship-to-station energy scans are complete." "The results?" Vorlag's voice was a series of resonant, melodic chimes that translated instantly through the universal system. "They are anomalous." Vorlag's posture, if possible, became even more rigid. "The vessel's fusion core," Ply chirped, its appendages fluttering over the console. "Standard analysis indicates its operational output exceeds its energy input. The efficiency rating is 110%. The High Counselor's head swiveled a full 40 degrees to face the technician. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. The first law of thermodynamics was not a guideline. It was an absolute. It was the foundation upon which all sane technology was built. A system could not produce more energy than it consumed. "Your instruments are malfunctioning," Vorlag chimed, the melody flat. "Recalibrate and run the scan again. Focus on the hull composition as well. I want a full materials workup." "Yes, High Counselor." David watched the subtle shift in the alien delegation. He couldn't read their expressions, but he recognized the universal language of a superior dressing down a subordinate. He glanced at Aris, who gave a nearly imperceptible shake of her head. Their core had been field-tested 1,000 times. It was a rugged, overbuilt piece of engineering, but its output was stable and well within known parameters. An error of that magnitude was not a simple misreading. "Something's wrong," Aris said quietly, her fingers tapping a rapid, silent rhythm on the back of her datapad. "Their passive sensors are running a much deeper diagnostic than standard protocol requires." "Let them look," David replied, his voice calm. "We have nothing to hide." His gaze drifted from the aliens back to his ship. He knew every plate and rivet on that hull. He had flown it through ion storms that should have torn it apart and navigated gravitational shears that, according to their own physics, were supposed to be inescapable. The Odyssey wasn't elegant, but it was durable. It had to be. It was a product of its environment, a place where the rules were less like laws and more like violent suggestions. Vorlag turned his attention back to the human vessel, his sensory organs processing the data streaming to his private display. The second scan was complete. The results were identical. The fusion core was still breaking the universe. But now there was something else. The atomic structure of the hull plating showed evidence of covalent bonds shifting into metallic bonds and back again, a fluid state of matter that should have required temperatures and pressures found only in the hearts of stars. Yet the ship was cold, dormant. It was, by all measures of Council science, an impossibility. Vorlag logged the data, his every precise movement belying the seed of deep, profound unease taking root in his logical mind. This was not an instrument error, it was a contamination of fact. The welcome hall was a cavern of soft light and serene, sculpted architecture. The air was perfectly filtered, the temperature uniform to 1/10 of a degree. To the humans it felt sterile, dead. David and Aris followed a pace behind High Counselor Vorlag, their boots making the only discordant sound in the immense space, a heavy rhythmic scuffing on the polished floor. The council delegates hovered in small silent clusters, their varied forms a testament to a galaxy of convergent evolution under a single stable set of physical laws. They all turned as the small human party passed, their gazes a mixture of curiosity and a new unreadable apprehension. Vorlag led them not to the ambassadorial suites, but to a wing designated for scientific and cultural exchange. As part of our standard integration protocols, Vorlag chimed, his tone perfectly neutral, the Council requests a voluntary biological and medical examination. Your data will enrich our understanding and ensure we can provide for any unique physiological needs. David glanced at Aris. It was a reasonable request, one they had anticipated. Our Chief Science Officer, Dr. Thorne, will volunteer, he said. Aris stepped forward, her expression one of professional interest. I would be happy to cooperate. I am just as eager to see how your medical technology compares to our own. Her hands, which had been still at her sides, began to move as she spoke, tracing an invisible diagram in the air. Our biomonitors are robust, but tend to focus on trauma and environmental resilience. I suspect your instruments are geared more towards subtle, systemic diagnostics. Vorlag's ovoid head tilted. They are precise. The medical bay was as sterile as the rest of the Citadel, a chamber of white surfaces and gleaming, silent machines that floated on gravitic lifters. There was no bed, only a raised dais in the center of the room. At Vorlag's direction, Aris stood on the dais, her practical jumpsuit looking drab and out of place in the pristine environment. A web of soft blue light descended from the ceiling, enveloping her. It was not a scan, it was an interrogation at the atomic level. Vorlag watched the data streams materialize on a holographic display, his usual composure beginning to fray. Ply, the junior technician, was monitoring the primary feeds, its appendages clicking nervously. Cellular regeneration rates are remarkable, the technician reported, its voice a strained, high-pitched series of clicks and whistles. Energy-to-mass conversion during mitosis appears to defy our conservation models. The system is generating new tissue at a rate that should produce a crippling energy deficit, yet her core temperature remains stable. Vorlag's focus was on the neural scans. Ignore the gross metabolism, report on synaptic activity. High Counselor, the neural processing speed it's a paradox. Electrical impulses are measured to be propagating faster than the material composition of her nervous system should allow. It violates the resistance-capacitance time constant of the cellular membranes. Aris watched them, a faint smile on her lips. She felt the scan as a slight tingle, a strange resonance in her bones. Is there a problem, High Counselor? Vorlag did not answer. He was cross-referencing the new biological data with the ship's impossible scans from the docking bay. The pattern was undeniable. The ship's defiance of thermodynamics was not an engineering quirk. The hull's unstable atomic bonds were not a new material science. The anomaly was not in the technology. The anomaly was in the humans. They were the source. Their very biology operated on a set of rules that contradicted the known universe. Their existence was a contradiction. Your species evolved on a Class 12 Deathworld, Vorlag stated, the chimes of his voice losing their melodic quality. Our archives are sparse, but they classify Earth as a world of extreme tectonic instability, high radiation, and a hyper-competitive biosphere. It's home, David said from the doorway, his voice drawing the attention of every alien in the room. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, a posture of casual observation that somehow commanded the space. We're durable. We had to be. Durability does not account for this, Vorlag countered, gesturing with a multi-jointed limb toward the flowing data screens. This is a fundamental disagreement with reality. Your cellular repair, your neural pathways, they do not obey the laws. Perhaps, Aris suggested, her blue eyes glinting with an analytical fire, your understanding of the laws is incomplete. The statement hung in the sterile air, an intellectual challenge that bordered on heresy. To the Council, the laws of physics were not a matter of understanding. They were a simple, observable truth, as real and as solid as the floor beneath their feet. The idea that their knowledge could be incomplete was, in itself, a terrifying thought. Vorlag stared at the human, this living paradox, and felt a sensation his species had nearly evolved beyond: fear. He was a scientist looking at data that proved his life's work, the work of his entire civilization, was built upon a lie, and the proof was standing calmly in the middle of his medical bay, offering theories with an unnerving academic curiosity. The apprehension in the medical bay solidified into a thick, palpable tension that followed them out. Vorlag, moving with a new, almost brittle precision, escorted David and Aris to a different chamber. This one was not a place of analysis, but of demonstration. It was a power systems laboratory, dominated by a large crystalline column at its center. This was a standard Xylan energy matrix, a device known and trusted across the galaxy for its absolute stability. It drew ambient energy from the Citadel's core and converted it into a pure, perfectly regulated power source for delicate experiments. Its output was a universal benchmark. A simple test, Vorlag chimed, the sound tight. To isolate the phenomenon, the matrix's function is governed by the most basic principles of energy transference. Its operation is a constant. He gestured to a small, smooth indentation on the console at the column's base. Dr. Thorne, please place your hand here and initiate the activation sequence. It is a simple, pressure-sensitive interface. David stood back by the entrance, his stillness a silent protest. He watched Aris, who met his gaze with a look of shared, cautious intrigue. This was no longer a passive examination. This was an experiment, and she was the variable. She approached the console, her earlier excitement now tempered by a professional sobriety. The column was inert, its crystalline structure holding the faint ambient light of the room. Aris took a breath, her fingers hovering over the smooth, cool surface of the interface. Then she pressed her palm against it. The effect was instantaneous and profound. A stream of pure white light shot up the center of the column, but it was the secondary effects that drew a collective gasp from the Xylan technicians present. The light was not merely bright, it was flawless. The slight, almost imperceptible chaotic noise that was inherent in any energy system, the quantum flutter that was a fact of the universe, was gone. The matrix's output, displayed on a monitor above the console, showed a waveform so pure, so perfectly sinusoidal it looked like a theoretical diagram. "By the Founders," one of the technicians whispered, the translation soft and reverent. "Efficiency," Vorlag commanded, his voice sharp. Please appendages flew across its own console. "Efficiency is 314%, and rising." The technician's voice was a squeak of disbelief. "Hi, Counselor, that is not possible." Aris kept her hand on the console, her eyes wide as she stared at the data. She could feel a strange thrumming through her palm, a sense of resonance, as if the machine was not just responding to her touch, but harmonizing with it. It was like tuning a chaotic engine by feel, an instinct she didn't know she possessed. The energy flowing through the matrix felt cleaner, more coherent. She flexed her fingers slightly on the panel. The light in the column brightened, the waveform on the monitor tightened, and the efficiency rating climbed another 10 points. She was controlling it, not through any conscious effort, but through a simple physical connection. It was as if her biology, born from a reality where stability was a luxury, was imposing its own chaotic order on the sterile physics of the Xylan device. "Remove your hand," Vorlag commanded. Aris pulled her hand back. The light in the column instantly dimmed, returning to its standard noisy state. The waveform on the screen grew a subtle fringe of static. The efficiency rating plummeted, settling back at its normal, predictable 99%. The stark contrast between the two states left the room in a stunned silence. The evidence was irrefutable. It was not a passive quality. It was an active influence. David pushed himself off the wall, taking a step forward. His expression was grim. "What is this, Counselor? What are you trying to prove?" Vorlag turned his obsidian head toward David, the emotionless facade of his species finally cracking. His resonant voice was low, stripped of all melody, leaving only a stark, chilling pronouncement. I am proving that your existence is a logical fallacy. You are not merely a biological anomaly. You are an ontological one. You do not simply exist within the laws of our universe. You actively, and I suspect unconsciously, rewrite them with your touch. The accusation was monstrous. It recontextualized their entire mission. They had come as diplomats, explorers seeking to join a galactic community. But in the span of a few hours, they had been reclassified. They were no longer envoys. They were walking, talking violations of nature. They were a contagion of impossibility, and the most horrifying part was, until this moment, they hadn't even been aware of it. Aris stared at her own hand, at the flesh and blood that had just casually overruled a fundamental constant of the galaxy, and for the first time she felt a sliver of the same fear she saw reflected in Vorlag's rigid posture. The Citadel shuddered. It was not the gentle, engineered vibration of a system at work, but a deep, violent jolt that threw everyone off balance. A percussive boom echoed through the station's structure, followed by the discordant shriek of alarms. Red emergency lighting bathed the laboratory in a pulsating, infernal glow. "Report!" Vorlag's chime was sharp, cutting through the sudden chaos. Ply, clinging to its console for stability, brought up a station schematic. "Impact! Sector Gamma 7, maintenance corridor, minor asteroid collision, hull breach confirmed, plasma conduit has ruptured." On the main screen, a live feed showed a terrifying scene. A thick armored conduit, as wide as a transit tube, had been sheared open. A torrent of incandescent blue-white plasma was spewing into the corridor, instantly vaporizing everything it touched. The corridor's automated containment fields flickered, struggling to form around the sheer energy output. They were failing. "Containment system response is lagging," Ply shrieked. "The plasma flow is too volatile. It will overload the local grid and trigger a cascade failure in 3, 2... There was no time for deliberation, no moment for a council vote. The methodical, logical processes of the Citadel's inhabitants were too slow for a crisis that unfolded in microseconds. Before Vorlag could issue a single command, David moved. It was not a decision. It was an instinct. He didn't run. He flowed. One moment he was by the door. The next he was across the lab, his movement a blur that defied the inertia of his own mass. His path was direct, economical, and brutally efficient. He reached a heavy maintenance panel set into the wall, a slab of reinforced alloy held in place by powerful magnetic clamps designed to withstand internal explosions. According to the Citadel's own safety specifications, releasing those clamps required a specialized gravitic lever and a 2-second discharge cycle. David didn't have a lever. He didn't have 2 seconds. He jammed his fingers into the narrow seam, his body braced. For a single infinitesimal moment, the sensors in the room registered a localized anomaly. The constant of gravity in the 2-meter space around David wavered. The inertial mass of the panel itself seemed to become negotiable. With a sound of screaming metal and tortured magnetic fields, he tore the 2-ton panel from the wall. The effort should have shredded the muscles and tendons in his arms and back. It should have been physically impossible, but he held it, balanced for a heartbeat, the immense weight seemingly trivial. Then he pivoted, his motion seamless, and charged toward the corridor visible through the lab's archway. The air crackled around him, thick with the smell of superheated metal and ozone. He didn't hesitate at the threshold of the plasma torrent. He moved into the blast, using the massive panel as a shield. The plasma hammered against it, the raw energy of a sun unleashed, but he kept moving forward. He slammed the panel over the ruptured conduit. The torrent was cut off. The blue-white inferno vanished, leaving only the scorched, blackened walls of the corridor and the glowing cherry-red maintenance panel, which was already starting to buckle and warp. David stepped back, his chest heaving, his knuckles bloody where he had gripped the panel's edge. He stood there for a moment, a solitary figure silhouetted against the smoldering metal. Silence descended upon the lab. The alarms cut out, replaced by the quiet hum of emergency systems. The Xylan technicians and council members who had witnessed the event were frozen, their minds unable to process what they had seen. They had not just watched a feat of bravery, they had watched a man treat the fundamental forces of the universe like suggestions. Vorlag stared at David, then at his own data console. The numbers were stark, unforgiving. The brief sensor log showed a localized fluctuation in the Higgs field. Mass, for a fraction of a second, had become a variable. The strength David had displayed was not biological. It was a physical law being bent out of shape by sheer, unconscious will. The action was instinctive. It was a reflex born from a lifetime in an environment where cause did not always neatly follow effect. It was the survival trait of a species that had evolved in a reality that did not play by the rules. The horror was no longer theoretical. It was standing before them, breathing heavily, his simple physical presence a refutation of their entire ordered existence. David had not just saved them, he had shown them that their reality was a fragile cage, and he was a creature from the wild outside. The emergency was over, but the true crisis had just begun. Vorlag sealed the laboratory, leaving David and Aris under the silent watch of two hulking Citadel sentinels. He moved through the station's corridors with a purpose that bordered on panic, his multi-jointed legs carrying him swiftly toward the archives of the Founders, the most sacred and secure repository of knowledge on the Citadel. He locked himself within its silent, cold chambers, the air thick with the dust of ages. For the next cycle, the only sounds were the frantic clicks and chimes of his interaction with the central data core, a repository stretching back millennia. He began with a single terrifying premise. What if Aris Thorne was right? What if their understanding of the laws was incomplete? He pulled up the original scans of the Odyssey, the impossible efficiency, the fluid atomic bonds. He cross-referenced them with Aris's biological data, the paradoxical regeneration, the faster-than-light neural processing. Then he overlaid both with the sensor logs from David's rescue, the localized instantaneous warping of mass and inertia. A pattern emerged, not of random anomalies, but of a single, consistent, underlying principle, a fundamental disagreement with the standard model of physics. Frantically, he began running simulations. He modeled a universe where the first law of thermodynamics was a suggestion, not an absolute. The simulation collapsed into chaos. He modeled a universe where atomic bonds were fluid. It dissolved into a gray, featureless soup. He modeled a universe where mass was a variable. It imploded into a singularity. Every attempt to reconcile the human's existence with stable reality failed. It was like trying to prove that 1 + 1 = 3. Unless the equation itself was wrong. His appendages flew across the archival interface, digging deeper than any Xylan had in 1,000 years. He bypassed the standard physics archives and delved into the forbidden data, the raw, unfiltered telemetry from the time of the Precursors, the godlike race that had supposedly seeded the galaxy with life and then vanished. It was a jumble of chaotic, paradoxical information that had long been dismissed as corrupted or allegorical, but Vorlag now looked at it with new eyes. He found what he was looking for in the logs of the Great Ordering, a precursor project of unimaginable scale. The data, when viewed through the lens of the human anomaly, painted a horrifying picture. The universe in its natural state was not the stable, predictable place the Galactic Council knew. It was a seething chaos of quantum instability, a place where causality was a negotiation and the constants of physics were anything but constant. The Precursors, for reasons the archive only hinted at, had not accepted this. They had imposed order. The standard model of physics, the very bedrock of galactic civilization, was an artificial construct. It was a cage. They had engineered a new set of rules, a simplified and stable reality, and projected it across billions of light years, forcing the universe into a predictable pattern. It was the single greatest feat of engineering in history and the foundation of every starfaring race in the Council. And then he found the map, a galactic chart from the time of the Great Ordering showing the project's boundaries. It was nearly total. Nearly. One small, insignificant spiral arm on the galaxy's fringe was marked with a symbol Vorlag had never seen before. A simple circle with a jagged line through it. The sector was labeled with a single chilling precursor word, quarantine. The coordinates were sickeningly familiar. It was the Sol system. They hadn't forgotten it. They hadn't missed it. They had omitted it. They had left it wild. Vorlag reeled back from the console, his logical mind struggling against the sheer universe-shattering weight of the revelation. Earth was not a death world because of its volcanoes or its predators. It was a death world because it existed in a feral, untamed pocket of true physics. The quantum instability, the causal ambiguity, it was the natural state of existence. Humans had not evolved to break the rules. They had evolved to master the real rules. He knew he had to present his findings. He convened a secret emergency session of the High Council. In the stark, silent chamber, he laid out the evidence. He showed them the impossible scans, the biological paradoxes, the localized warping of reality. Then he showed them the precursor map. "The humans are not anomalies," Vorlag concluded, his voice a dead, toneless chime. "They are not violating the laws of our universe. They are a product of a universe with different laws. Laws that are more fundamental, more chaotic, and to us, utterly lethal. Their arrival is not a first contact. It is a sign. The cage is open. The feral zone has breached containment." A wave of existential terror washed over the assembled delegates. They were the product of a sheltered reality, a cosmic garden nurtured behind an invisible wall. The humans were the first creatures to have climbed over that wall, bringing the terrifying, unpredictable wilderness with them. Their very presence was a threat to the illusion of stability that had defined galactic life for eons. The Council's response was not born of malice, but of absolute existential fear. Logic dictated the immediate and total containment of a threat that could unravel the fabric of their reality. There was no debate, only a swift, unified vote. The verdict was delivered not by a herald, but by the cold, impersonal actions of the Citadel itself. A low hum vibrated through the deck plates of the Odyssey's docking ring. Heavy, armored blast shields, unseen until this moment, descended with pneumatic finality over every viewport, plunging the human delegation into an artificial twilight. Red emergency lighting, the same that had signaled the plasma rupture, now flickered to life along the corridors connecting them to the Citadel. A shimmering, golden energy field materialized, sealing the docking port. The air, which had been a mix of Citadel and Odyssey atmosphere, was suddenly purged, replaced by the recycled air of their own ship. They were cut off. "David, what's happening?" Aris's voice was sharp with alarm. She was at the main comms panel, her hands flying across the controls. "I've lost all contact with the Citadel network. The port is sealed, and they've imposed a hard-level energy screen. Nothing is getting in or out." David walked to the main viewport, now just a slab of gray metal. He placed his hand on its cool surface, his expression unreadable. "They're scared," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Vorlog's experiment, my little stunt in the corridor, we're not what they thought we were." "Scared enough to imprison us?" Aris shot back, turning from the console. "We came in peace. This is a violation of every first contact protocol in the book." "They're not using their book anymore," David said grimly. "They're using ours, or what they think is ours. The one where you quarantine a contagion." His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Contagion. It was what Vorlag had called them, an ontological anomaly, a walking paradox. Now the Council had made it official. On the other side of the golden energy field, Citadel sentinels, twice the number as before, took up rigid positions. Their weapons were not drawn, but their posture was an unmistakable message of containment. A single channel opened on the comms panel. It was audio only. Vorlag's resonant chimes filled the bridge, but they were stripped of all warmth, a sterile official pronouncement. "By decree of the Galactic Council, the vessel Odyssey and its crew are hereby designated a causal hazard, level Omega. You are to remain under absolute quarantine. No communication with your home system will be permitted. No transport to or from your vessel will be allowed. You will comply, or we will enforce." The channel went dead. Level Omega. Aris ran a quick search on the term through their offline copy of the Council's public database. Her face paled. "David, there is no level Omega. The highest threat classification is a level Gamma for planet-killing kinetic weapons or Grey Goo scenarios. Level Omega, it's not on the list. They created it just for us." They were no longer ambassadors. They were a category of disaster unto themselves. David felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had faced death in a dozen different ways, from catastrophic engine failures to the silent, creeping cold of a suit breach. But this was a new kind of threat. They were being condemned not for what they had done, but for what they were. He looked around the bridge of the Odyssey, the scarred bulkheads, the overbuilt and redundant systems, the faint, familiar scent of recycled air and machine oil. It was a piece of home, a bubble of their reality. And outside that bubble, an entire galaxy was looking at them with horrified eyes, seeing them as a disease that could rot the foundations of their universe. A blockade, Aris's console soon confirmed, was being formed. A fleet of Council warships was moving into position, not around the Citadel, but far beyond, creating a perimeter around the entire Sol system. They weren't just imprisoning the Odyssey. They were severing humanity from the stars. They were trying to put the monster back in its cage. But David knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the cage itself was the problem. And they were about to find out it was far more fragile than they believed. The first cycle of quarantine passed in a tense, suffocating silence. The second was marked by frustration and a dozen failed attempts to breach the Citadel's communication blockade. By the third cycle, a new routine had settled in, one born of pragmatism and a shared, unspoken understanding. David took charge of their small crew's morale, organizing work details and physical training, keeping them focused on the familiar rhythms of shipboard life. His calm, steady presence was an anchor in the storm of their uncertainty. Aris, however, retreated into her own world. The laboratory section of the Odyssey became her sanctuary. She locked herself away with the data, projecting it onto the lab's main holographic display. The room became a swirling vortex of equations, sensor logs, and biological schematics. She was not just reviewing the events, she was dissecting them, hunting for the thread that connected every impossible moment. She started with the Xylan energy matrix. The data from her own ship's logs, which had been passively recording her bio-output during the experiment, confirmed the Citadel's readings. Her proximity and touch had not added energy. It had altered the quality of the energy, reducing the quantum noise to near zero, which the Xylan system had interpreted as a massive spike in efficiency. It wasn't more power, it was perfect power. Next, she pulled up the sensor logs from David's confrontation with the plasma leak. She isolated the readings from the 2-meter area around him. The numbers were ludicrous. A momentary localized dip in the gravitational constant, a fractional temporary reduction in the inertial mass of the maintenance panel. It wasn't that he had been strong enough to lift it. It was that, for a fraction of a second, the panel had become easier to lift. He hadn't overpowered the physics of the Citadel. He had unconsciously convinced them to get out of his way. "It's not a violation," she whispered to the empty lab, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "It's a negotiation." She began running simulations on the Odyssey's computers, their processing cores built on the same chaotic principles as their biology. Unlike Vorlag's, her simulations didn't collapse. When she introduced a variable state for physical constants, her systems didn't crash. They adapted, finding new points of equilibrium. Her reality was fluid, and so was her technology. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. While the Citadel had cut them off, it had not stopped its own internal processes. The ambient sensor sweeps that continuously monitored the station's health were still washing over the Odyssey's hull. Aris programmed her systems to analyze the incoming sensor data, looking for the background radiation, the energy signatures, the quantum resonance of the Citadel itself. She wanted a baseline for their stable universe. What she found was terrifying. She isolated the unique energy signature of Precursor technology, the deep, resonant hum that powered the station's core functions. According to all Council records, that signature should be immutable, a perfect and eternal constant. But it wasn't. She mapped the readings over the last 3 cycles, creating a time-lapse model. There was decay. It was infinitesimal, a statistical ghost in the data, but it was undeniably there. The Precursor's great cage of physics, the artificial reality that sheltered the galaxy, was losing power. It was like a battery, unimaginably vast and powerful, that had been running for eons and was now finally beginning to fail. The very stability the galaxy was built upon was a temporary illusion. The fundamental laws were not just being challenged by their presence, they were actively fraying at the seams, all on their own. She overlaid the decay rate with the data from her matrix experiment. Where her hand had touched the console, The Matrix hadn't just become more efficient. The local background radiation from the Citadel's precursor tech had, for that brief moment, stabilized. The decay had stopped. Her blood ran cold. "David," she said over the ship's internal comm, her voice strained, "you need to see this now." She didn't have to explain the implications when he arrived. He saw it in the data swirling around her, in the graph that showed a slow, inexorable decline. They were not a contagion threatening to break the cage. They were the only ones who had noticed the cage was already rusting through. And the Council, in their terror, had just locked the only people who could patch the holes on the outside of the fence while the storm of true reality gathered on the horizon. The unraveling began not with a bang, but with a flicker. Deep within the Citadel's core, in a chamber shielded by a dozen layers of exotic matter, lay the primary regulation hub. It was not a machine in the conventional sense. It was a piece of original precursor technology, a nexus where the artificial laws of the standard model were enforced and distributed throughout the station. For millennia, it had been the most stable object in the known galaxy. Then it flickered, a single microscopic fluctuation in its energy output. A technician in a monitoring station miles away noted the event, classified it as a sensor ghost, and dismissed it. An hour later, it flickered again, this time with a corresponding gravitational eddy that caused the technician's stylus to float from his desk for half a second. This time, he filed a report. On the bridge of the Odyssey, Aris saw it too. Her passive sensors, now attuned to the Citadel's deepest rhythms, registered the fluctuations as sharp spikes in the decay rate. "It's accelerating, David," she said, her voice taut. "Whatever is happening, it's getting worse." The flickers became more frequent. The lights on the Citadel began to strobe, not in the rhythmic pulse of an alarm, but in a chaotic, unpredictable pattern. The artificial gravity plating in some corridors would surge, pinning occupants to the floor, while in others it would fail completely, sending them drifting toward the ceiling. Alarms began to sound, but they were distorted, their chimes and shrieks warped into a discordant symphony of a system losing its mind. High Counselor Vorlag stood in the central command nexus, his rigid posture the only point of stability in a room gone mad. Screens blinked from data to static, holographic displays dissolved into meaningless patterns of light. His technicians, the most brilliant minds of the Xylan race, were useless. Their diagnostics failed because the principles on which they were based were becoming unreliable. They were trying to fix a broken engine, while the very concept of mechanics was ceasing to exist. "The primary hub," a frantic technician chirped, its voice trembling. "It's failing. The constants are drifting. We cannot recalibrate because there is no stable baseline to calibrate to." Vorlag watched the main schematic. A shimmering purple-black sphere of influence was expanding from the Citadel's core. It was a null physics bubble. Inside that bubble, the artificial laws of the precursors had completely failed, leaving only the raw, untamed chaos of the feral zone. Anything that entered it, ships, people, light itself, would be annihilated, its matter and energy disassembled by a reality with no rules. The bubble was growing. At its current rate, it would consume the entire Citadel, the quarantined Odyssey, and the Council fleet in less than an hour. Panic, a corrosive and unfamiliar emotion, swept through the command nexus. The delegates of the Council, watching the catastrophe unfold from their secure chambers, descended into a frenzy of blame and desperate, useless suggestions. Their technology, their logic, their entire civilization was predicated on a stability that was now revealing itself to be a lie. They were children of the garden, and the walls were collapsing. David and Aris watched the same schematic on their own bridge. The purple-black sphere was a visualization of their home. It was the physics of Earth blossoming like a cancer in the heart of the Citadel. "They can't stop it," David stated, his voice a flat line. "Their tools only work inside the cage. They don't have a single instrument designed to function in the wild." Aris looked at the growing sphere, then at the readings from their own ship's core, which hummed along with perfect chaotic stability. An idea, wild and terrifying, began to form in her mind. It was a solution born of desperation, a gamble that would either save everyone or hasten their destruction. "David," she began, her eyes locked on his, "the Matrix experiment. I didn't just fix it. I think I synchronized it with my own biology. I imposed our reality onto it." David's gaze followed hers to the schematic. The null physics bubble was their reality. The failing Precursor Hub was the Citadel's, two different operating systems trying to run on the same hardware. "You think we can do the same thing to the hub?" "Not impose," she corrected, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't think we're strong enough to overwrite the whole Citadel, but maybe we can create a bridge, a hybrid state, teach the old machine how to work with the new rules." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "It's an insane idea." "Yes, it is," David agreed, his hand moving to the comms panel. "It's our only shot." He activated the one channel he knew the Council would be monitoring, the quarantine frequency. He had nothing to offer them but the one thing they feared most: himself. "Hi, Counselor Vorlog. This is Ambassador David of the Odyssey." David's voice, calm and measured, cut through the cacophony of alarms and panicked chatter in the Citadel's command nexus. It was so starkly different from the surrounding chaos that it commanded immediate, absolute silence. Every head, every sensory organ turned toward the source of the sound. Vorlag stood frozen, his ovoid head angled toward the comms unit as if it were a venomous creature. "We see what's happening to your station," David continued, his tone devoid of accusation or triumph. "We understand why. Your fundamental physics are failing. The artificial stability your precursors created is collapsing." The directness of the statement was a physical shock to the assembled aliens. He was not guessing. He was stating a fact, a truth they had only just discovered themselves, a truth that was currently tearing their world apart. "Dr. Thorne has analyzed the decay," David's voice went on, steady as a rock in a tidal wave. "And she has analyzed the nature of our own influence on your technology. We are not a contagion that causes the decay, Counselor. We are a product of the reality your systems are reverting to. We can't stop the process. No one can. But we believe we can manage it." Vorlag found his voice, the chimes strained. "What are you proposing?" "The problem is one of translation." Aris's voice now joined David's, sharp and academic even in the face of annihilation. "Your Precursor Hub is trying to enforce a set of laws that no longer have the energy to remain dominant. The result is a system crash. We propose to interface directly with the hub, not to repair it but to resynchronize it, to teach its core logic how to operate within the chaotic, variable framework of true physics." A wave of murmurs swept through the council chambers, a mixture of horror and disbelief. Let the source of the chaos near the very heart of their power? It was madness. "You would destroy us all," a delegate from a silicon-based species rasped over the secure channel. "Look at your screens," David's voice replied, hard as iron. "You're already being destroyed. Your methods have failed. Your science is useless. You have seconds, maybe minutes, before that null physics bubble consumes this entire station. You can die clinging to the rules of your cage, or you can trust the ones who learned to live in the wilderness." The brutal logic was undeniable. Vorlag looked at the expanding sphere of chaotic reality on his main display. It had already swallowed two of the Citadel's outer rings. The weapons of the fleet were useless against it. Firing into it was like shooting a bullet at the concept of mathematics. He was a being of pure reason, and reason dictated that when your only tool fails, you must consider another, even if that tool is the very thing you fear. "What do you require?" Vorlag chimed, the decision made. "Lower the quarantine field on our docking port. Grant us direct, unimpeded access to the corridor leading to the primary regulation hub, and clear a path. We don't have time to negotiate with your sentinels," David commanded. There was a tense pause. The fate of the most powerful structure in the galaxy rested on this choice: to trust the paradox, to embrace the violation. Vorlag gave a series of sharp, melodic commands. On the bridge of the Odyssey, the golden energy field sealing their docking port flickered and died. The armored blast shields retracted with a heavy groan. The path was open. "Aris, are you sure about this?" David asked, turning to her as they prepared to leave the bridge. His face was a mask of grim determination, but his eyes held the question. "No," she admitted, pulling a diagnostic toolkit into her satchel out of pure habit. "Theoretically, our biology's innate causal influence should allow us to interact with the raw physics of the hub without being annihilated. We're compatible. But this isn't a controlled experiment with an energy matrix. This is open-heart surgery on a god." "Then let's try not to slip," David said. They moved together, out of their ship, and into the chaotic corridors of the Citadel. The lights strobed erratically, and the air itself seemed to thrum with a discordant energy. The alien sentinels, who had been their jailers moments before, now flattened themselves against the walls, their posture a mixture of terror and awe as the two humans passed. The two living paradoxes, the ambassadors from the feral zone, were walking calmly into the heart of the storm. They were not going to fight reality. They were going to negotiate its surrender. The corridor to the primary regulation hub was a scene of cosmic breakdown. Gravity shifted under their feet with every step, one moment tripling, the next threatening to send them drifting. The air shimmered, and the walls themselves seemed to flicker between states of matter. It was a physical manifestation of the universe losing its certainty. For David and Aris, it felt unnervingly like a turbulent Tuesday afternoon back home. The chamber housing the hub was a massive sphere. At its center, floating in a web of crackling, dying energy, was the Precursor device. It was a perfect obsidian orb, 10 meters in diameter, but its surface was no longer smooth. It was fractured with veins of purple-black chaos, the null physics reality bleeding out from its core. This was the source of the Citadel's destruction. On the observation deck, high above, Vorlag and the remnants of the Council watched on a single stabilized monitor, the only one still functioning. They saw the two small human figures step into the chamber. The humans wore no protective gear, no energy shields. They were walking into an ontological hurricane. David and Aris stopped at the edge of the platform before the hub. They didn't consult instruments or run diagnostics. Aris dropped her toolkit. It was useless here. They simply stood, closing their eyes for a moment, feeling the chaos wash over them. It was a language they understood not with their minds, but with their bones, their cells, their very being. "It's angry," Aris said, her voice quiet but clear in the thrumming air. "It's like a muscle that's been held in one position for too long. Now that it can finally move, it's just thrashing." "So we calm it down," David replied. They reached out, not with their hands, but with their will. They didn't try to force the hub back into its old rigid state. That was the mistake the Precursors and later the Council had made. They embraced the chaos. David focused on the concept of stability, not the rigid, brittle stability of the Citadel, but the dynamic, fluid stability of a spinning top, one that finds its balance in constant motion. Aris focused on connection, on taking the thrashing, contradictory laws of true physics and weaving them into a new coherent pattern. To the horrified eyes of the Council, it looked like a strange, silent dance. The two humans stood perfectly still, yet the energy around them began to change. The violent, destructive purple-black fissures on the hub's surface stopped expanding. The raw chaos stopped bleeding out. Instead, it began to flow, to swirl. It was drawn to the two humans, circling them like iron filings to a magnet. They were not imposing order. They were providing a new center of gravity for reality itself. The chaotic energy which had been annihilating everything it touched began to coalesce. The raging storm of paradoxes was being tamed, not by force, but by acceptance. David and Aris were introducing a new state of being to the hub, a hybrid physics, one that was more volatile than the Council's safe, sterile cage, but infinitely more resilient than the raw chaos of the feral zone. The light in the chamber shifted from a violent purple to a deep, steady, oceanic blue. The gravitational fluxes smoothed out. The strobing lights of the Citadel steadied, now shining with a light that seemed richer, more vibrant. The null physics bubble on the schematics did not vanish. It solidified, shrinking to encompass only the hub itself, now a stable, self-contained system running on a new, negotiated set of rules. The immediate threat was over. The Citadel was saved. Vorlag stared at the screen, his logical mind shattered and rebuilt into something new. He had witnessed the birth of a new cosmology. The humans hadn't used tools or technology. They had used themselves. Their innate ability to exist in and influence a chaotic universe was not a flaw or a weapon. It was a skill. The most important skill in a galaxy that was, he now understood, just beginning to wake up from a long, artificial dream. He looked at the two figures on the screen, the ambassadors, the prisoners, the saviors. They were turning to leave the chamber, their movements calm, almost casual, as if they had just finished a routine piece of maintenance. The council had been horrified when the humans left their death world. Now a new, more profound horror settled in. They had not been imprisoning a threat, they had been trying to cage the future. And they had just watched, with their own terrified eyes, as that future calmly and quietly rewrote the laws of their universe, not out of malice, but because to them it was simply the sensible thing to do. The age of the garden was over, the age of the wilderness had begun, and these were its masters.